and welcome. UVA Speaks is a podcast of Lifetime Learning, a division of the Office of Engagement at the University of Virginia. Lifetime Learning brings the knowledge and expertise of UVA's faculty to the university's alumni, friends, and families. My name is Susan Lynch, and I am the Associate Director of Lifetime Learning at the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement. This podcast features John Owen, who is the Ambassador Henry J. and Mrs. Marion R. Taylor Professor of Politics in the Department of Politics at the University of Virginia. He's also a Senior Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture and at the Miller Center for Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. From January to June in 2024, Owen has served as an academic visitor at Nuffield College at the University of Oxford in the UK. His latest book is The Ecology of Nations, American Democracy in a Fragile World Order. In this podcast, Professor Owen will talk with us about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization known as NATO. So thank you, Professor, for speaking with me today.
My pleasure, Susan. Thanks for having me.
Great. So first, this year, NATO is commemorating the 75th year of collective defense. Can you please provide us with some context to the origins of NATO and some of the issues that have impacted the alliance over the years?
Yes, and I'll start by saying, NATO is sometimes called the most successful military alliance in history. I think that's probably true. I mean, history, that's covering a lot of ground, but it's certainly in the modern world, very successful, by which we mean no NATO country has been attacked by an outside country since the alliance formed in 1949, so it has a perfect record. There have been terrorist attacks, of course, particularly on the United States, 9/11, but Russia has not attacked a NATO country. It's attacked Ukraine. That's not a NATO member. NATO has been so successful that it's really been expanding. Countries want to join it. It has to sort of turn away countries. This is not always true of alliances. So for all of that, I'll say a little bit about where it came from. NATO was originally a Cold War alliance of Western European and North American countries. Canada is a member. Mostly democracies. Its obvious task when it started in 1949 was to counter the Soviet threat that was already looking quite serious. It's important to remember that NATO actually was not an American idea originally. Lots of people don't know this. It was the idea of some of the Northern European countries in 1947, 1948. World War II had recently ended. The Soviet Red Army, which had lost the most troops by far in the war. The Soviet Union lost 40 people for every one American lost in World War II, and almost all against Nazi Germany. And so when the Soviets would liberate a country from the Nazis in Eastern Europe, the Red Army would just stay there. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and so on were occupied countries, the eastern part of Germany, including Berlin. So the Soviet army was not demobilizing, though the war was over. It was just staying there with its tanks and troops and so on. And they began imposing communist rule on these countries in the late 40s. So the governments of Western countries, such as Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and even Britain, were quite worried about this. They weren't really worried about a Soviet invasion as much as they were Soviet infiltration, intimidation, that could lead to instability in their own countries and government collapse and so on. And so they wanted a whole package of things from the Americans and had to persuade the United States to do this. And one of those was an alliance, a guarantee from the United States to defend them and deter any kind of Soviet attack or infiltration or anything like that. Now, if you know anything about American history before this period, before the 1940s, you know that the United States just didn't do peacetime alliances ever since George Washington. Washington had advised against it. So the United States fought alongside democracies in World War I, World War II, but that was wartime. This was peacetime. And so it really required a wrenching change in the way people in Washington and really throughout the country thought about America's place in the world to agree to join NATO. The Truman administration saw its way to saying yes. And crucially, key Republicans, back then the Republican Party had some real isolationist elements. They all began to agree it makes good sense, given the rising Soviet threat, to have this big alliance. So we will in fact guarantee the security of these countries. And until recently, America's not really looked back NATO feels very normal politically, socially, and so on. As you said, I'm in the UK, and this is a different country to be sure, but part of the alliance. So a lot of the debates I read in the papers here are pretty similar to what we have back in the States. You asked about, too, some important issues over the years, and I'll give you three just quickly, issues that have been important and some of which have recurred over the years. And the first one is, who should be let in to NATO? Who should be a member? Again, lots of countries want to join. The first concern really was West Germany, the western part, the democratic part of Germany. This was opposed. So NATO forms in 1949. The West Germany's not yet an independent country, but it's on its way. And France and some other neighbors of Germany opposed Germany joining the alliance. You can understand why. World War II had just happened. The Americans favored it. West Germany finally admitted in 1955. That was a major moment in modern European history. A second, probably more familiar moment is in the 1990s and early 2000s, the Cold War was over. A number of ex-communist states, former Soviet allies or satellite states, wanted to join. And there was a debate in the West, including in the United States, about whether this was a good idea, how should it happen, when should it happen. So NATO, it was ultimately decided, yes, we will let countries in. They have to meet certain criteria. They have to have a certain level of military spending and technology. They have to be a democracy with a market economy. That had not been a rule before. So starting in 1999 and in various waves after that, ex-Soviet allies like Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic began to join. Others followed. Most recently, this is an important question, who's in, because who's in NATO? Ukraine and Georgia both were part of the old Soviet Union. They have lots of people in them that want to be in NATO. And partly, big reason why Russia attacked Ukraine was he didn't want it to join NATO. So that's not the only reason, but Moldova is another country, a small country in this situation. All right, so a second important issue over the years is how to defend NATO's members, how to deter the Soviet Union, or now Russia. And the role of nuclear weapons has been really controversial here. I would say the most dramatic moment came in the 1980s when NATO began to deploy what were called intermediate range nuclear force missiles in Western Europe. This was a decision made by the Carter administration and the European governments in the 70s, implemented by the Reagan administration. And they did this to match similar forces Soviets had already installed in Eastern Europe. So NATO was just sort of meeting, if it's like a poker game, meeting the Soviets. But when NATO began deploying these missiles in Western Europe, there were massive protests by the peace movement. European governments very much wanted these weapons, and so it happened. And the third big issue, and this is my last, that has vexed NATO the whole time, and it's certainly been big lately. What is NATO for? What's it for? Now, that may sound obvious. It's a military alliance, but should it just be about defense and deterrence, or should it go on offense? Should it see itself as part of playing a larger stabilizing role? So this came up when the Cold War ended. Some people in NATO were wondering, does NATO still need to exist? The Soviets are gone, right? The decision was made in the capitals of the NATO countries to stay in business. And the first mission post-Cold War was to help pacify the breakup of Yugoslavia in the Balkans. Communist Yugoslavia was falling apart. So people my age and older will remember the civil war in Bosnia-Herzegovina, then the Kosovo War. Much more recently, NATO acted jointly in Afghanistan, and so on. But this question keeps coming up. What's this thing for? Before Russia attacked Ukraine in 2022, the Trump administration was asking, do we really still need NATO? Is it really helping America? And the president of France, Macron, said, NATO's brain dead. So So it's a recurring question. Right now, say in Europe, you're not hearing the brain dead line since Russia attacked Ukraine. You're not hearing that so much anymore. But those are three big questions that have vexed the alliance for years.
Great. Thank you so much for that context. That really helps to understand. And yes, it seemed that there was quiet times in some ways, but probably because the deterrence was working in some ways. So,
that's right. Yeah. It's sort of like, I don't know, they say a referee in a ball game, they're doing their job best when you don't really think about them. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. So in preparation for this podcast, I was watching, some YouTube clips, and in particular, I saw a conversation with the NATO military chief, and he was talking about the rise of technology and how that has impacted warfare. For example, cyber attacks are obviously a modern concern. Can you talk about the complexity of these issues, what it's brought to sort of concerns around, how has NATO needed to adapt to these concerns?
Yes, there's lots to say about this. It's a hot issue or hot set of issues. I will just say a few things, partly because this is such a technical matter that I quickly lose my ability to speak with authority about it. Also, just very uncertain, a lot of it's speculative. But I'll say a few things. First of all, there is a set of technologies that military people classify as disruptive because they disrupt established modes of warfighting. One is AI, artificial intelligence. Another is autonomous systems, which is related to AI, but the caricature is killer robots, but there's a lot more than killer robots to this. And a third is quantum computing, which is a promising computing technology, a method of processing information that's much, much faster even than the fastest computers we have now. Now, it's too early to say really precisely how these and other disruptive technologies are going to affect warfare, but I'll say something about AI, artificial intelligence, just to illustrate. History shows that technological advance matters a lot in warfighting. Who wins, who loses, how long the wars last, how destructive they are, the aftermath. One technology, not the only one that really matters, that improves one side's ability to win quickly, is the ability to find the enemy, track the enemy, predict when he'll be where. This gives the advantage to the side that's best at this. And AI is very good at helping militaries with this. It is assimilating vast amounts of data and of all kinds and coming up with recommendations for decisions. So, for example, suppose you're a U.S. Navy vessel in the Persian Gulf. To the south is Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, Arab Gulf states that are friendly to the United States. To the north is Iran, not friendly. An unknown boat is coming your way, and you think it might be an Iranian attack vessel. It might be just a fishing boat or a leisure craft. I can't tell. It might be a Saudi boat. Previously, you would just use the people around you. There would be some computing help, but AI actually dials that up a number of notches. An AI system can gather visual data. What does the boat look like? How fast is it going? What kind of wake is it leaving? Compare that to thousands and thousands and thousands of cases, similar cases. It can assimilate auditory data. What sound is the boat making? The motor, how about the propellers underwater? It can compare that to tens of thousands or even millions of similar cases. And very quickly, faster than it's taken me to say what I've just said, it will give you a very good answer about whether you should fire on that boat or not. So this is so important, this ability to identify and place vessels, that some naval people are saying AI might make submarines really easy to locate. All right. And that in turn would force the United States and therefore NATO, in a sense, to alter the way it uses its Navy. You see, during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviets developed lots and lots of nuclear warheads. And the United States had what was called a strategic triad. Some of the nukes were on bombers, aircraft, some were land-based missiles, ICBMs and others, and some were submarine-based missiles. And the United States placed great confidence in its sub-based nuclear arsenal because the subs could hide. The Soviets had a lot of trouble knowing where our subs were and therefore where our nuclear warheads were. However, if AI makes it really easy to find subs, then that third leg of the strategic triad becomes a lot less valuable. So that's the sort of thing AI could do. Okay, so that's kind of the NATO side of the American side of things. A second point I want to make is there's already a sort of quiet arms race with China going on over some of these technologies. So militaries have to think about future threats. They have to think about specific countries that they're not at war with, but could be someday. And so for NATO, that includes Russia, obviously, but also possibly China. Those two authoritarian giants are growing closer for a variety of reasons. And here, it's important to know that China has, for some time, been trying to become the world's leader in AI, both for civilian and military purposes, just as the United States is. There's nothing nefarious about that. But the Beijing government really has invested vast resources into AI and other technologies. And this means that even if the United States and NATO didn't want to invest in AI, they would pretty much have to, for the reasons I've just stated, that it's probably going to get, almost certainly going to give a huge advantage, information advantage to the side that's ahead. And so the third point is directly about NATO. NATO comprises 30 countries. There are always coordination problems in NATO. They always worry about what they call interoperability of systems, and this is going to afflict these technologies as well. So NATO has already come up with a strategy on how to develop AI quickly and coordinate those developments and make all the systems interoperable. There's one other thing I know they're really discussing deeply, which is an ethical issue about AI. So AI can also, an algorithm can also make a decision, not just assimilate information and come up with a recommendation. It can also come up with a decision. So you might say that sounds even faster. If there's a premium on a fast and accurate decision, why not let AI make the decision too and not hand it over to a colonel or a lieutenant who's distracted and might make mistakes? But of course, that removes the human element. And there is an ethical question here, right? And so one thing NATO countries are arguing about is maybe it's the case that China and Russia aren't troubled by this. They're authoritarian. Maybe they're going to be handing these decisions over to computers. As democracies, we at least need to talk about this before we do that. But the problem there is if machines are making the decisions, they're going to act more quickly. So you see the dilemma. It's quite a vexing one, and I know that NATO countries are discussing it, and there's some disagreement apparently among them about the right answer.
I can see how that would be a huge issue of concern. I would certainly want to have a human element in there, and
yeah,
certainly you can think of in history when a human element made a huge difference, like in the Cuban Missile Crisis or something like that.
Right, that's right.
We avoided something because people were talking with one another that were not talking with one another.
It's good that John F. Kennedy was the chief decision maker. Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. And, it would seem that the war in Ukraine has brought the biggest threat to the NATO alliance. And can you talk about this war, sort of how it is being fought and how it has brought about, an expansion to NATO?
Yeah, really pertinent question. Russia's massive invasion of Ukraine, February 22, is the greatest ground action, military action since 1945 in Europe, and the greatest threat to NATO countries, especially the eastern ones, since the 1940s. But because it's such a great threat, it has actually strengthened NATO, at least in the short term, as an alliance, right? And all that's kind of implied in your question. This war is in some ways a traditional ground war, the sort that some, gurus thought was never going to be fought again. But it's being fought by armies on the ground and using lots and lots of artillery. I mean, lots. And it's horribly destructive. Artillery now is very accurate and destructive. It's very good at breaking things and destroying things. Not so much aircraft in this war. Aircraft became integral to ground war as far back as World War II. This is more, in some ways, more like World War I on the Western Front, trench warfare. but it's different in some ways. So drones are being used, and lots of strategists are watching and tacticians are watching this to try to figure out if drones, AI operated armed drones, are really affecting ground warfare or not, if this is a serious development. But I think on the whole, it's much more a traditional war than people thought. This, in a way, plays into Russia's hands because Russia has a much bigger population, bigger army, more hardware than Ukraine. Ukraine relies very, very heavily on the West, on NATO, and the United States. Russia, it's not just army on army. Russia has, as we all know, sometimes during this war, used terror tactics on civilians, especially early in the war. It's attacked Ukrainian cities to punish civilians, to intimidate them. That's become less common. Hasn't really worked. It's just made the Ukrainians angrier and more patriotic. So that's probably why Russia does less of it, but they still do some of it. Another important feature of this war that I just alluded to is NATO is helping Ukraine with hardware, with training, with money. Without that, Ukraine would have collapsed a long time ago. They know it. That's nothing the Ukrainians won't tell you themselves. There's a constant debate in NATO countries. Sometimes it gets hot, sometimes it fades away, but it's always there, about what weapons systems, what aircraft to give Ukraine, on what terms. There is, of course, growing sentiment in some countries, in particular in this country and in the Republican Party in particular, to reduce aid to Ukraine. And so there was a delay in this large aid package on Capitol Hill till recently. And this really has been consequential to the war over the past 6 months or so. Ukraine's position has suffered. They haven't lost the war, but they had to wait on some hardware that they had expected earlier. And where the war is going, it's hard to say. Russia has been doing well recently. They've launched a new offensive in the northeast of Ukraine. And so the Ukrainians are feeling a bit, not like they're on the verge of collapse at all, but seems to be slightly going Russia's way. But it may have a long way to go yet. The war has strengthened the NATO alliance, though. And this is part of how international relations works. Right? When you have a group of countries facing a common threat and they agree on that threat and its severity, they tend to band together. We call this balance of power theory. And so the two ways Russia's attack on Ukraine has done this is it's forged more political solidarity among the NATO members, including a renewed European desire to keep the United States in Europe actively, keep the U.S. military in Europe. And that was not necessarily the case before Russia attacked NATO. Some Europeans were friendlier toward the idea of the United States maybe, weakening its commitment, because isn't it high time Europe had its own capacity for defense? A position, actually, ironically, Donald Trump took when he was president. So that's one thing. The talk, especially in Europe, about we don't need NATO, we don't need the United States. You're not hearing so much of that right now. The second thing the war has done for NATO is it's caused NATO to grow. And in a serious way, Finland and Sweden both have joined. I think most of our listeners know this, but one remarkable thing about that is those were two longtime neutral countries. Sweden in particular, for centuries, had been a neutral country. Opinion in both countries, public opinion and elite opinions, flipped overnight. And I remember I was at a cocktail party in Washington, and I don't usually go to these things. I'm a professor at UVA and proud to live in Charlottesville, but I happen to be. So I met a former Swedish prime minister and foreign minister who was still stunned. This is just a few days later. He was quite stunned. He said, I cannot believe, he was very happy. He's wanted Sweden to join NATO for a long time. He said, finally, it's happening. For a bad reason, but I'm glad it's happening finally. So why is this important? Sweden and Finland have serious militaries. Finland has an 800-mile border with Russia. They don't need any lead time. They are ready to go. It's really a question of interoperability with other NATO countries. These are serious problems, and this is a real miscalculation Putin made. If he thought he would be weakening NATO in attacking Ukraine, he's had the opposite effect. So those are the two big effects on NATO.
Yeah, interesting. I had read that too. I didn't realize that Finland had such a robust military, and it seems that some of the European countries not not as much as one would think that they would have.
Right. True enough. Yeah.
And so, yeah, certainly strengthening the NATO alliance there. So thank you for that. So, what does the war in Gaza and the instability in the Middle East mean for NATO, if at all?
Yes, it's that's of course got to be on everybody's mind. It's such a horrific war, and it's so difficult to see a path to ending it. But in any case, it doesn't really impinge on NATO, certainly not directly. I don't doubt that at the upcoming NATO summit in Washington, it'll be discussed. This is a chance for diplomats and heads of government to talk about all kinds of things. And so I imagine a lot of Europeans are going to be pressing the Biden administration on how are you what can you do more to end this war quickly? But that's really a political diplomatic concern. Nobody is contemplating that I know of. Nobody's contemplating a role for NATO in that war. I think it's safe to say neither Israel nor Hamas would want NATO to get involved. Maybe some neighboring Arab states would like it, but it's just not going to happen. Once the war ends, and it will end at some point, there could be peacekeepers, maybe from some NATO countries. I don't think officially, again, NATO would have a role there, but some countries might. Now, the war could have an indirect effect of politically dividing NATO countries, by which I mean, after last October 7th, most NATO members almost reflexively backed Israel stoutly because the Hamas attack was so horrendous. It murdered and brutalized so many civilians. But of course, since then, tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza have been killed by the Israeli Defense Force, and including thousands of civilians. And that has turned some public opinion in some NATO countries, at least partly against Israel. So we'll see how this plays out in a kind of grisly way. I don't think even if there is political difference among these countries in NATO, it will really interfere with alliance solidarity. They really are thinking as NATO about Russia and sort of in the background China.
Yeah, I'm sure they don't want to take their eye off of that ball because it's such a big thing. But yeah, such an area of concern right now, though. So, and finally, in July, you just mentioned that Washington, D.C. will be hosting a NATO summit. So what do you see as, we've talked a little bit about some of that, but what do you see as the most pressing areas of concern that will be addressed at the summit? And where do you see NATO in the coming years?
I think the two biggest topics facing NATO are, first of all, the war. And I'll say a little bit more about that. The Russo-Ukrainian war, Russia's war in Ukraine. And the second is the U.S. election this November. So starting with the war, they're going to be talking in Washington about how to win it and what comes after it's over. Ukraine's not a member of NATO, of course, but NATO is heavily invested in, if not a Ukrainian outright victory, which is frankly hard to foresee, an outright victory where Russia is completely ejected, not just from Donbass, from eastern Ukraine, but from Crimea. Just hard to see that happening, short of a real collapse of the Russian army. But there may be other ways, at least, to punish Russia and weaken Russia in the medium term. Anyway, NATO government's going to be they talk about this all the time, but they really need to focus on right now in going to the summer of 2024, how to do this. Partly this is urgent because, again, Russia has had some success with a new offensive in northeastern Ukraine. So there's been some discussion there's a lot of discussion actually about shouldn't the United States finally deliver weapon systems to the Ukrainians that they can use to attack Russian assets on Russian territory, because Russia is able to launch missiles from its own territory onto Ukrainian territory, including Ukrainian cities. And Ukraine can hit those back if it uses its own assets, or it can use British assets, Storm Shadow missiles. But the United States has deliberately, out of concern for not causing World War III, for provoking Russia to actually attack a NATO country, has said, no, we're not, you can't, Ukraine, you cannot use our weapon systems to attack Russian territory. Some European governments say, why not at this point? It's pretty clear Russia is not going to use nuclear weapons in this war. When the war first started in 2022, there was a lot of fear. And I was rattled by this. A lot of us were, that Russia, if Putin is so risk-seeking as to attack Ukraine with so much of his army, maybe he's risk-seeking enough to actually use at least tactical nuclear weapons. I don't think that's the case. And so if it's not the case, then the reason for not letting Ukraine at least use U.S. assets to attack Russian soil falls away, or it's a lot weaker. All right. So the second thing they're talking about in relation to the war is whenever and however the war ends, maybe with a settlement, an armistice, Russia gets to continue to occupy some Ukrainian territory, at least for now, something like that. But should Ukraine join NATO at that point? What about Georgia? Should they be full members? Is there some halfway house for them that would still deter Russia but not provoke Russia? Where do we go from here? So that's going to be a topic ongoing. And I think the second big topic, and this may, I don't know, I would love to sit in and see how they talk about this, because it certainly will be talked about quietly in private meetings, the U.S. election this November. And I say that because Donald Trump is, on many measures, now the favorite to win in the Electoral College. And so Europeans, and then I'm in the UK again, so I know they're starting to price in, as it were, a Trump victory, another Trump presidency, into their strategic thinking about defense and NATO. And this matters because Donald Trump is a known skeptic, very open skeptic of NATO, or at least of the way contributions of military budgets within NATO. And by the way, I'll say this, Trump is far from the first president to criticize the Europeans about this. Just about every U.S. president, certainly since the Cold War ended, was quite exercised about what we call burden sharing. The United States, it's the biggest economy, has the biggest military by far, but it also spends a larger percentage of its gross domestic product on its military than any European country, any NATO member does. And some have spent as little as almost 1%, 1.2%. And all the European governments say, yeah, that's not enough. We know, we'll fix it soon. They never do. So Trump really pressed them. But in addition to that, Trump's attitude seems to be, I'm not sure we want to be in NATO. These are rich countries. They don't respect us. Maybe we should just pull out. I think Russia's actually a pretty good country, or Putin's a pretty good guy. All that sort of thing. It really, really spooks the Europeans. And so the Biden administration really wants to reassure them that, no, the United States is in. But I happen to know a lot of Europeans say, yeah, so you say. But we have to think longer term than that, and we are worried. So that'll be a big topic, at least under the surface.
Yeah, very uncertain times in so many ways, as we've just discussed. And it would be interesting to be in on those meetings.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Professor Owen, for sharing this information, about NATO. It's important for all of us to learn about such critical national and international defense issues and organizations, especially in these complex and destabilizing times. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise with UVA's alumni, friends, and families.
Thanks for having me on. It's been great fun. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank you for listening. For upcoming podcasts and other Lifetime Learning programming, recordings, and blogs, please visit our website at engagement.virginia.edu/learn. You can also find our podcast on the Virginia Audio Collective, which is a network of UVA podcasts hosted by WTJU Radio and can be found at virginiaaudio.org. So thanks again, and we look forward to you taking part in future Lifetime Learning programs.